Joining us now, of course, on the line to talk about this is the head of communications at Doctors Without Borders, Southern Africa, and that's Borrie La Grange. Good evening to you, and thank you for talking to us. I mean, these migrants were rescued by this charity after, of course, the interception of human trafficking boats at the weekend.
Yeah, Melanie, that's correct. So we collaborate with SOS Mediterraneee as Doctors Without Borders on the Mediterranean in what's commonly referred to as the rescue zone. Now, the rescue occurred on Saturday, and what, in a bit of an ironic twist, there were Italian Coast Guard vessels that participated in the original rescue of these people off of rubber dinghies, and then they were transferred to our boat, the Aquarius, on Saturday. So for us, it's really bizarre that the Italian authorities would then close their ports to our boat after their own Coast Guard participated in the rescue of these migrants and refugees. So the people who were brought onto the Aquarius, as of this afternoon, after much to and fro, as many of your viewers will know today because of this, there's now been a decision by the Italian Maritime Rescue Coordinating Center that about 400 people that were housed on our boat were now transferred back onto Italian Coast Guard vessels. And then we're left with 229 people as we're setting sail for Valencia to disembark there. So essentially what we can say is that the Italian government's conduct has been absolutely disgraceful in this sense, in particular because of this incident.
Borrie, Spain has said it felt duty-bound to do this in order to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe, but this is a growing crisis, and with countries like Italy begin to take this tougher stance, where is it going to end?
Well, I think that's an open question. The reality of it is, you mentioned yourself that many of the people on the boat today, 21 of them had serious chemical burns, and this is a result of being exposed to fuel and seawater over long periods as they're making their way across the Mediterranean. So they have these injuries. There are other people who are on the boat with us today who have orthopedic injuries that require very urgent surgical interventions as well. So these people have been subjected to extra days at sea and basically have become pawns in a political game by the Italian authorities. And what's really at the heart of this problem is the inability of EU states to share asylum seekers among the member states and to relocate people accordingly. And this is a political problem that those authorities need to figure out. Our job is to try and provide as best we can rescue and medical services because people are still very desperate and they're still crossing the Mediterranean. Many of them fleeing out of Libya where they're exploited, they're abused, and they're kept in inhumane detention facilities, which form part essentially of the EU's policies of containment and essentially pushing people back into harm's way.
Well, it's quite extraordinary, Borrie, that, to note that some of these, as I said in my introduction, some of these migrants were children and pregnant women. I suppose the question to ask is what becomes of them now? We've seen, of course, groups like Amnesty International slamming Italy for its approach on this. But what happens to them now?
Well, essentially the dictates of EU laws suggests that upon disembarking in Italy, that's where people will be processed, and that's where they then would enter the EU, and potentially they would be resettled if they're asylum seekers. But our immediate concern is always to provide medical care to people who need that, but also psychological support because of the trauma that people have experienced. But the difficulty that we're now faced with here is this flip-flop by the Italian authorities and essentially a very cynical approach to people who are vulnerable and who are very desperate.
Right, we're going to have to leave it there. Of course, I mean, the statistics that I have said that at least 500 people have already died this year alone trying to cross the Mediterranean. That's, of course, compared to nearly 3,000 last year. So this is a situation that's certainly going to continue to raise concerns. That was Doctors Without Borders Head of Communication, Borrie La Grange. Now,